Ha! This is Laborc, and it is so nice to have you here. These are the paints you need. We start with rhinox hide. Apply it around the helmets. You don't have to apply it super clean, just slap on it fast and use a base layer consistency. Then I switch to a crappy brush with a split tip to apply mournfang brown roughly. Just stipple the paint on. I'm using these photos for highlight reference, so the area before the mini should be highlighted the most. When the paint starts to dry between the bristles, I apply a bit more force to the brush and I'm kinda dry brushing over the base, catching all the edges with it. I mix some zandri dust to the mournfang brown and start reducing the highlight areas. And as you see, the bristles are split nicely, so this allows me to do a fast stippling motion. This will create a rough texture over these rocks and make it a bit more interesting. Let's paint the helmet's red part with word bearer's red. If you are not sure which part is red and which is gold, just check the character card that comes with the game. Usually these illustrations are always a bit different from the actual mini, but can offer a little help when trying to figure out these things. Since we sketched out the red parts, let's work on the gold. I start with rhinox hide as a base coat. Try to leave the cracks and the damaged parts on the metal black, so we don't have to blackline them later. Let's move on to sketching the highlights. I use Dumble brown, but any dark brown mixed with a little bit of red would work fine. On the Hulkbuster helm, I create two highlights, one bigger on the right side and a smaller one on the left. When you are painting NMM, basically the more reflections you have, the more it will read as metal. NMM means non-metallic metal. When we try to paint the metal parts with regular paints, not using any paint that has metal pigments. Continue with XV88. As you can see, I reduced the highlight areas even more and use stippling motion along the process. This is a beat up helmet, so we need to communicate that with our paint job. If you apply the paint this way, you will have some extra texture that is not very smooth, which is great. We want some roughness. It is nice to have smooth blends every now and then, but some roughness can also look cool. Having said that, a tiny little glazing wouldn't hurt anyone. So thin down your paint with water or glaze medium and move the paint from the darker color to the brighter one. Just 1 or 2 coats of this glaze should be fine because we don't want perfectly smooth blends this time. Next, I'm using gold brown. Same stippling motion and I do some edge highlights around the eye sockets and armor panels on the Hulkbuster helmet. You can try to do some on the smaller helmet as well, but the details are not as crispy, so it might require a bit of freehand. Remember, this is the base. Papa Laborc don't want you to drain your mental stamina all the way here. This is just a nice warm-up for the mini. Now glazing time again. Blend in our new layer and don't let the paint flow into the recesses or I will slap on your tiny hand. To push the highlight values, I mix some ice yellow to the gold brown. This will increase the contrast on the helmet more and helps with the metallic effect. When applying layers, it is crucial to wait for them to dry before applying the next one. If you work on a surface too much with your brush, then it won't be smooth. It will have a chunky texture and we want to avoid that when painting NMM. I also went back on the helmet on the back with gold brown to create some extra highlights. Lastly, I did some edge highlights with ivory. I usually use a thinner consistency for that, because at the same time I'm applying some highlights as well. You can use a base layer consistency for edge highlights and thin it down when you're about to stipple the last highlights on the helmet. Thinner consistency while blending helps a lot, and you can build up the opacity slowly. It's the same like granny's chewing on a chicken leg. One chicken finger at a time and accompany it with some loud chewing noises because we want to savor these steps and enjoy the moment. Then I went back and created another highlight on the Hulkbuster helmet. This is just a secondary highlight, so I only go as far as the gold brown layer. Don't paint all your highlights with the same intensity. Metal has a lot of reflections that are a bit dull and it makes it more realistic. Let's work on the red parts. I use Evil Sun Scarlet to sketch the highlights there. This is one of my favorite paints. It's very vibrant red and has great coverage. Light is coming from the left, so you can leave 50% of the right side of the helm with Werberer's red. This helmet is basically a half sphere, so we need to highlight it as such. If you have any trouble with highlight placement, just look at your reference photos and look up images about different shapes and objects. Remember, everything is a sphere, a cylinder, a cube or a cone. Reduce the highlight areas with Wild Rider red. As you can see, I'm using thin layers, so I don't really need to glaze between them to make them smooth. Obviously, the Wild Rider red and Evil Sun Scarlet are super close to each other on the color wheel, value-wise, so they blend easily. I mixed some sunny skin tone to the Wild Rider red to create these brighter highlights. Follow the shape of the sphere, but also you can edge highlight along the armor panels. After that, I went in with a super dry brushing of zandri dust. Wipe your brush off on a paper towel well and just lightly dry brush around the edges of the base. Don't worry about getting it over the helmet. It will blend in nicely with the rest of the base because we don't know how far this helmet was on the ground, so a little bit of dust appearing on it, it's just normal. Now for the finishing touches. Add some sunny skin tone to the zandri dust and do another round of light dry brushing. And that's it for the base, guys. So let's do the rest of the mini. Okay, let's do the armor first. That's the most time-consuming part because we have so much surface with many edges. Let's start with the gold again. I covered some rib armor and thighs with gold, but you can be pretty free with which part you want gold and which ones you would like to have red. Papa Laborc is not a superhero expert, so I don't know which parts should be gold or just steel looking or red. And I know some of you guys going to throw up in the mouth a bit, but I also don't know which mark or pole this armor is. But if you guys know, please let me know in the comments, that would be much appreciated. You can see that once I apply the paint, I won't go back to the same area and fiddle around with the brush more. This way, once the paint dries, the surface will be smooth as Granny's butt cheek. To increase the smoothness, Papa Laborc glaze over the surface to blend in the new layer. It's a handful of layers, but it's worth the time. Where you feel like you lost some crispiness, then do some black lining. Basically, we just create tiny lines between the armor panels and it will benefit us greatly, because it gives us more definition and gives an overall clean feel to it. You don't have to go crazy with it because the armor is beaten up pretty well, but it's a nice skill to have in your mini painting tool belt. Let's go on with gold brown. Reduce the highlight areas a bit more and cover 80% of the previous layer. Wait for the layers to dry, and when you are glazing, always use the same brush motion, moving the paint from the darker to the brighter color. Over and over again until it gets nice and smooth. If you put the mini next to your face and it feels like Granny's butt cheek, then you will know you are on the right path. Push the contrast with some ice yellow. And as I go smaller and smaller with the highlights, the more I use stippling. This allows me some room to fail, which is very important. I painted some golden a good couple of times, but the old and shaky hands of Papa Laborc can make mistakes anytime. But since I only create these tiny dots with a thin consistency, if I hit a red part or crevice of the armor that I intentionally try to avoid it, wouldn't be big of a deal. Lastly, with pure ice yellow, let's continue the process and put some emphasis on the crackles on the armor because those broken parts are where light would catch the edges the most. I also did some edge highlights where I can, but you can try and make a contour around the armor panels. It could look interesting as well. Use a base layer consistency and don't let the paint run into the crevices or I will slap on your tiny hand. Cover the rest of the armor with word barrels red. Use base layer consistency and try to aim for a smooth finish. Try to leave some separation between the armor panels so we don't have to blackline later. This mini is really well sculpted and by far the best plastic simon ever produced. I'm really pleased with the result, and if they increase the quality at this rate, they won't be far from Games Workshop in a few years really. Okay, let's continue with Evil Sunz Scarlet. Light is coming from the left, so the right side of the mini needs to have bigger highlight areas. This is very crucial if you want to get better at painting. We need to define where the light comes from, so when we look at the finished mini, it will be clear for us. This also helps us when creating highlights on the miniature. If you don't know where the light is coming from, then you don't know where, how, and what intensity you need to create the highlight. It's a common mistake for beginners that they highlight everything on a mini that is basically raised, but that is not realistic. If someone prefers that look, that's great, but if you want to paint something with a bit of realism, then you need to understand this concept. Alright, let's continue with Wild Rider Red. It's stippling time again for the most part. Oh guys, if this is the first video you saw from Papa Laborc and if you follow this tutorial, please share your results with me on Instagram or Facebook. Both links are in the video description. As you see, I'm edge highlighting next to stippling. I like to do that even these are not the final edge highlights, but give me an overall hint on which parts I need to work on the highlights more. I did not record it, but I did glaze some after this part, just a little bit. We don't want to lose the texture that stippling created for us. Add some sunny skin tone to the Wild Rider Red and reduce the highlight areas more. Sunny skin tone is great for red highlights because basically there are two ways to increase the value of red. We either add white or yellow to the mix, but using white only won't increase the luminosity of our paint and it will create pink eventually. And using only yellow will make it orange, and sunny skin tone is basically orange mixed with white. When you are highlighting the cracks on the armor, only use this color where light would catch the surface. So aim for the bottom of the edge of the cracks and leave the edges that are face down. You can see on the back of the mini that most of the crevices are black and we can paint around them nicely and still have some nice definition. It's not like Granny's stoma bag, okay? Okay. Okay, now let's use pure sunny skin tone. Super tiny portions for highlights inside our previous layer, and remember, we don't need the same intensity on every highlight. I do some edge highlights where the edge is facing upward. Use a heavier consistency to make those edges crispy, like Granny's blanket when she fell asleep with a cigarette in her mouth. While stippling, you can add some extra dots around the previous layers, so they will read as tiny scratches on the armor. I glaze over this layer as well to smooth it just a tiny bit, but I won't do more than 2 coats. We need those textures that we created. If you want something super smooth, then glaze all the way, but it feels weird with all the scratches to have a perfectly smooth surface, but it's just a personal preference. We have some steel looking elements on the thighs and around his glowing thingy. So let's paint those with a neutral darker grey. You might think that it would be smarter that we painted those inner parts before finishing the leg. Well, we can agree that Papa Laborc is better at painting than logistics. But if you use a tiny amount of paint at the point of your brush, you'll be fine. But don't thin it too much. Otherwise, you will flood these parts and that will only reward you with a huge slap on your tiny hand. After that, reduce those highlight areas with light grey, or just add some sunny skin tone or white to the dark grey you previously used. Small amounts, and don't go crazy around the glowing thingy. You need only a couple of small highlights. Cover the glowing thingy with ivory, and since ivory is almost a white paint, wait between the layers to dry. These types of paints always dries to a matte finish, which is very hard to paint smoothly, so be patient. This part is going to be super bright, and if it's not smooth, it will draw the attention badly. See? It's nice and smooth like Granny's butt cheek. If I put it next to my face, I couldn't tell the difference. Is this Granny's butt cheek? Let's glaze some wet blue around the edges of the glowing thingy. Same rule applies here as well. Wait for it to dry. Use a hairdryer or ask Granny to blow on it to reduce the drying time, but only apply the next coat when the previous one is completely dry. This light blue glaze will emit a faint glow which looks nice and pretty easy to do. Alright, let's work on the face. I start with bugman's glow. Same thin layers like we did before. When using a black primer, it's a bit harder to figure out all the details on the face, so that's the downside of it, but having a really high contrast finish is nice, so that's why I almost use it every time. Only leave the extreme shadows black under the eyebrows and cheeks. Paint the shoulder too, where the armor is busted, and the other hand. After that we glaze over to blend in the color and make it smoother. A couple layers of glaze should do that. Then we give it a nice wash of purple tone or any purple wash you have. Since we are painting a dead body, we don't need to use regular healthy skin tones. Now highlight it by adding some necrotic flesh to the bugman's glow. We are placing the highlights on the forehead, chin, nose and around the jawline. We can go higher with the contrast. Since it's an undead face, you can make it wrinkly as much as you like. For the eyes, I used ice yellow. Try to tackle them from the side because it's easier that way. I won't paint the iris because I prefer this empty dead look for a zombie. With mournfang brand, I paint back the lower eyelids and around the blisters on the forehead. Also, it gives a nice hue under the cheek's skin tone. After that, I go in with pure necrotic flesh and push the contrast a bit on the major highlights areas again. Forehead, nose, cheeks. Don't forget about the rest of the skin on the shoulder and right hand. On the hand, try to avoid the crevices of the muscles to enhance this dry and rotten look. Paint the inside of the mouth with word barrels red, or leave it black, whatever you prefer. Then pick out the teeth with ivory. I'm not sure if the teeth is sculpted, that it has some little crevices between them, because I can't really see it, so I just paint some tiny vertical lines, leaving a tiny bit of black between them. Since it's not a toothpaste commercial and zombie Tony Stark probably not a fan of Dantaker, let's give these shiny white teeth a wash of light tone to make them a bit more dirty. Give a light coat of Evil Sunz Scarlet around the blisters and wounds on the face. This will give some extra hue to the face overall and some definition to the blisters on the forehead. It reminds me so much of Granny's feet. For the hair, I used the same grays as I did for the metal parts. Really tiny portions of dark grey, so the hair will still read as black. If you apply too much, then your hair will look like grey. But wait, look at your hand. Why is it red and hurt so much? Because I slept on it, so be careful with the grey. Now apply even less light grey, and if you feel like you overdid it, just mute it back with black. You see, I'm only applying this tone to one side of the mini where the light is coming from. This way, the hair still reads as black. I went back for the blisters and applied gold brown to them. So now we all know those are tiny gems filled with some nice and warm cream. Reminds me of Granny's vanilla custard. For finishing touches, I apply a light glaze of angel green to all the shadowy parts of the miniature to increase the depth of the shadows. Green is complementary to red, so it's great for that. Very thin glaze and don't paint over the highlights or I will slap on your tiny hand. This is just a faint hue for the shadows, but gives our paint job that extra push. Same method for Evil Sun Scarlet, but we paint only over the midtones, not the shadows and not the highlights. This will make our red paint job richer and overall a bit more, red. For the highlights, we glaze some daemonic yellow, or basically any yellow you have. Most importantly, we glaze this next to the highlights and not over them. We just want to increase the luminosity of these highlights. And lastly, we look at our mini and adore it like it's a Sunday afternoon with Granny. So thank you for joining me on this little painting adventure. A huge thanks to my Patreons who support these kind of videos, with special shout out to Jonathan Rhodes, Cold-Blooded Dom, trying to paint minis, Jonathan Mosner, Rulzak, Vlad D, EarthApple21, Paints and Games. If you want to support the work of Papa Laborc, you can do that on Patreon, where you will have early access to these videos and you can vote on the next mini. Or if you need some bit of extra help, online coaching is now available. I hope the rest of your day will be as smooth as a granny's butt cheek.